Let's talk now about the way that you can process sound digitally, and you'll be doing this in most of the programs that we'll be talking about in this class. We've already talked about Audacity and the sound effects that you can find there. Sometimes they're what are called plugins, but let's get a little bit what are the definitions of the standard ways of doing audio effects. So many times when we talk about audio effects, we'll be talking about them in both a physical mixer and the mixers in the software. Sometimes they're referred to as auxiliary sends or effect sends. Remember when we looked at the Mackie analog mixer earlier, we saw that there were auxiliary sends, which allows us to send the input coming into that channel to an output channel, and that can be sent to a separate reverb box or to some other kind of function. We have the same thing built into most of your multi-track recorders and software programs. We will have auxiliary sends as well, and that's where we will pull up some kind of insert. You can either do it as an insert effect or as an auxiliary send effect, and slightly different ways those operate. So usually in the software we would do a insert effect. We would send it to a particular software, a plugin many times they're called, which would have that particular effects processing that would then be routed back into the mix. So when we talk about sending things to the processed sound, we tend to then mix them back together once it comes back in. So then we talk about them as the wet and dry signals. The dry signal is the non-processed sound that was the original sound recording. So once the wet sound, that's the sound that has all the processed effect on it. And so often you could have just the wet sound, or you could have a mixture of the two. Usually we want to hear the direct sound coming and then the mixed sound with us. So most of these effects sound more natural when we mix them together. For example, reverb is a very common kind of effects processing the effect we'll be using, which is simulating the effect acoustically that we hear in a live hall or a room, where we hear the sound traveling directly to us, to our ears, first coming from the sound source, but then a slight delay, we will hear sound, reflected sound, that is bouncing off the walls or bouncing off the back wall or the ceiling or the floor, that's coming to us with a little bit different spectral content, but coming to us with a certain delay. So generally, when we think about processing sound, and we want to kind of create a kind of a feeling of of satisfaction, we want to have both the processed sound and the dry sound or unprocessed sound mixed together. You also have something called post-fader and pre-fader in this, and this is where we can have the affected or processed sound that can come back in where the amount that is going to that is determined before we have the output fader, or you can do it after the fader. So we could control both the amount of sound that is going to the mix, which would, as we pull that fader down, we would be also controlling how much goes to the effects processing. So that would be a post-fader phenomenon. Pre-fader, then whatever the mixes we're going to does not change the amount going to the effects processing. So these are terms that we'll have to always negotiate whenever we're looking in any kind of a software design for effects processing. So here, just quickly, the broad categories for different kind of audio effects. We'll first be looking at dynamic range processing, then filtering, equalization, time-based effects, and then a few other categories. So let's look at dynamic range processing. Dynamic range is the difference between essentially the quietest part of the signal and the loudest. So when we talk about recording sound, if you are listening to a Western orchestra, often in the very soft sections of a Western orchestra, you may have the violins doing a soft tremolo, and the volume of that, the softest section, maybe 2 or 3 or 5 decibels level. At the loudest sections, you may have 8 trumpets and French horns and bass drum all crashing away. You may have something approaching 110 decibels at the very loud. So we would talk about what is the dynamic range of an orchestra. Might be, in some pieces, from 3 or 5 decibels up to 110 decibels. So we would need in order to represent that, we would need a dynamic range of at least 105 decibel range in order to have that sound understood. So when we're talking about dynamic range processing, we're either going to be understanding what is coming into the signal, what kind of range we have, and manipulating that range. So if we try to narrow that range, where we have a processor which takes the softest sound, pulls it up to a louder sound, and then pulls the loud sound down, we talk about that as being compression, where we compress the dynamic range into a smaller range. So let's say we record that orchestra that has essentially a range of 110 decibels, and we compress that into a 25 or 30 decibel range. That means every sound then fits within a certain dynamic capacity, and there are certain reasons why we would compress and not compress. So you can talk about extreme compression as being limiters, and then other ways of expanders. So we usually use dynamic range processing as insert effects. So if you have an analog mixer, there usually is an insert effect on the output of that. That means it's going to be going directly for that particular sound source. It will be mixed into the signal coming back into the mixer before you have any of the output faders on that. So insert effect is often what you'll find in the software as well. By automatically altering the amplitude of an audio in such a way that its dynamic range is changed is what we're doing, which allows us to compress or expand the dynamic range. So here are the standard sort of dynamic range processing effects you will use. Compression, we mentioned. This is the narrowing the dynamic range by reducing its amplitude after it reaches a threshold value. And that threshold value, the compression ratio usually is going to be less than a 3-to-1 ratio. So compression, if we reach a certain threshold, then the sound will be compressed within that. So we can set that threshold higher and higher so that any sound that comes in would be brought above that threshold ranking. Compression is used almost always heavily in certain kind of instruments such as drums, which have a very wide range, and sometimes your drum dynamic range of your percussion instruments is much louder than the other instruments you're trying to record. So many times you try to compress the drum to make it match with the other ones. There's also a certain change of the timbre, of the energy of the sound when you start to do compression. So when you look at popular music on the radio, or your iTunes or whatever, most of the time that is heavily compressed music. So that it's there for a number of reasons. It's both for practical reasons. Many times when you're listening to music through radio, you're in your car, and your car usually will have some kind of noise threshold of wind noise that's coming in. Sometimes it's 20 to 30 dB worth of wind noise. So if you have a recording that is going down to, like the orchestral example I mentioned, that's going down to 3 or 5 decibels, you wouldn't be able to hear that with a 20 dB noise in the car. So often if you're listening to orchestral music in the car, you have to turn the radio volume up in order to hear those soft sections to get it above the threshold of the noise, of the wind. But then when the brass section comes in, you've now boosted that 110 up to 130. So you have to turn that down. So often those kind of uncompressed forms don't work in the kind of normal world where you want everything into a medium level. But compression also does change the quality of the sound, and many people prefer to have a lot of compression to get the sound into sort of one domain where it can often be played at a very loud volume, but so that the peaks are not going to be too extreme, which would be painful if you move everything up to a high level. If you look at electronic dance music, for example, when you go to an electronic dance club, usually the music is played at a very high level, so you're often exceeding 100 decibels. But you want to have that consistently at a point right below the pain threshold, because you want to keep it about 20 dB range, but have the whole thing played about 100 decibels. So there's many reasons why compression is perhaps one of the more common dynamic range processing systems. You could also put a limiter on that. A limiter is essentially a compressor with a very high ratio. So usually your limiter is going to have a ratio of maybe 10 to 1 to it. An expander is going to be doing just the opposite. It's going to be boosting certain threshold levels. So sort of boosting it faster than normal. A noise gate is often very commonly used. Low amplitude is mapped straight to 0, removing noise below a certain threshold is the definition of a noise gate. Now, side change input and ducking are another important ones that you'll find often, which is a triggering effect. Ducking, the definition is a type of side chain input. Ducking is used often when you have voice and instrument, for example, if you want to reduce the level of one audio signal when another one is present. So a definition of ducking, for example, to reduce music underneath the voice. So let's say I'm speaking to you, but then when I'm not speaking, you want to hear the instrumental music louder. But each time I speak, I don't want the instrumental music to be too loud over my voice. So ducking is an impact where I insert a compressor onto the music track, And then I create a send channel on the voice track that routes part of the signal to a bus, and then the bus is sent into the music track's compressor as a sidechain input. So what happens is the input coming off the voice would then be sending that data as a compressor track put on on the instrument track, so that each time the voice threshold reaches, it turns on that compressor, which compresses the instrumental track down to where it stays below the voice. So I don't have to then be turning down manually. Anytime I would be speaking, the instrumental track would go slightly below me because there would be a compressor turned on that track, triggered from the voice each time it comes in. So that's why ducking is perhaps most used in different kind of radio functions or media functions where you need to be able to hear the words at all times. So it's a little bit more complicated, but it's the same idea of creating a sort of dynamic compression, but triggered from a second sound source. And then gating in general is the most common use for drums, as I mentioned before. And many times you find different kind of gates which have a very severe kind of gate on them that produces a kind of a different quality of of drum sound that are preferable in certain genres. Filtering. We've talked already a little bit about filtering. We've talked about the four primary type of filters you'll run across: the low-pass filter, the LPF, the HPF, the high-pass filter, the BPF, the band-pass filter, and then the notch, which is also a band reject filter. So these are used for different kind of effects in digital audio. For example, the wah-wah effect, which you found many times if you ever listened to the 1970s sort of funk music and R&B music, there was a wah-wah pedal that many performers would use on their guitars or different instruments, and that became very popular. What it is basically a band-pass filter with a time-varying center frequency is what a wah-wah is. So these kind of filtering techniques are used for different kind of purposes, but you'll find them built into most samplers, to most devices will have some kind of filtering in them so that you can process them and have some kind of time-varying kind of change to the timbre of the piece. So filtering is another very important area.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.